Allô, allô,
Ouais,
c'est bon?
marche.
C'est bon? Ok.
Oui, elle dit qu'après, il ne marche pas.
Donc, bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Merci beaucoup d'être venus pour cette conférence, double conférence, je dirais même. Plutôt cette discussion, ce débat autour de la question du vivant. Donc, j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir deux intervenants. Le premier intervenant, c'est Alessandra Covini qui vient de le studio Ossidiana. Donc, elle sera en distanciel, comme on dit aujourd'hui. Donc, Studio Ossidiana est une agence d'architecture fondée par donc, Alessandra Covini et Giovanni Bellotti en 2015. Le ludique, le tactile et l'inclusive se côtoient indistinctement dans leur pratique, avec une attention tout particulière aux habitants animaux de notre planète. L'agence donc, est basée à Rotterdam et a présenté Plateforme for Human and Birds à la dernière Biennale de Venise. Un paysage modulaire riche en mouvements et en possibilités d'action, manger, jouer, toucher, converser et négocier les relations possibles entre notre espèce et les autres espèces. Mais avant cela, nous allons commencer. J'ai le plaisir d'accueillir Francesca Guerrieri. Francesca qui n'est pas architecte, elle voulait bien qu'on le souligne. Mais par contre, elle est chercheuse en biologie moléculaire et travaille au CRCL, le Centre de recherche sur le cancer de Lyon. Ces recherches donc explorent l'épigénétique et l'interaction entre le microbiome, virus, bactéries, et la cellule humaine, l'univers entremêlé du vivant non-humain à l'intérieur du vivant humain, autrement dit. Avant son installation à Lyon, Francesca a travaillé à Rome en tant que directrice de la plateforme de génomique et de séquençage d'ADN de l'université de Rome la Sapienza. Depuis quelques années, elle a étendu ses centres d'intérêt en développant également des projets de séquençage de micro-organismes qui résident sur les monuments et sur les vestiges archéologiques, je dirais plutôt, les découvertes archéologiques, les vestiges archéologiques. Donc, c'est avec Francesca que nous allons commencer cette soirée. Francesca, c'est à toi.
Merci. Bonsoir à tous. Donc, oui, je ne suis pas architecte, je suis chercheuse en biologie moléculaire et mon parcours scientifique a été lié à des études sur l'ADN et la relation entre la cellule et le virus. Ce soir, je vais vous parler d'un sujet relativement nouveau de la science qui concerne le microbiome. Ça veut dire les micro-organismes que nous avons en nous. L'étymologie du mot biologie vient du grec, signifier étude de la vie. Et la biologie liée à la compréhension de l'homme, c'est au début forcément focalisée sur notre corps, visée à comprendre son fonctionnement au niveau physique et chimique. Et la conséquence naturelle de cette focalisation a longtemps été une idée de l'homme au centre de tout, au centre de l'univers et surtout une mesure de la représentation du monde. Mais à côté de cette image de l'homme qui domine tout ce qu'il y a autour de lui, la nature, l'environnement, etc., l'idée d'un homme dans la nature, dans son environnement, fait son chemin dans les pensées. Et aussi, la biologie change sa définition d'être vivant, d'être être humain. Parce qu'on ne peut pas simplement le définir pour comment il est fait dedans, pour ses molécules, ses cellules, etc., mais aussi pour l'interrelation qu'il va établir avec son environnement, avec la nature. Et donc, le mot qui prend la place dans les pensées scientifiques est l'interrelation. Donc, interrelation, bien sûr, avec la nature, avec l'environnement, mais il y a aussi un deuxième niveau, qui c'est l'interrelation à l'intérieur de nous-mêmes. Donc, entre la même cellule, entre des cellules différentes, entre des tissus différents. Et il y a enfin un troisième niveau, qui c'est l'interrelation avec les micro-organismes qui vivent en nous, qui résident dans notre corps. En fait, en 2016, grâce au séquençage d'ADN dans l'intestin, il est devenu clair que notre corps était habité par de nombreux micro-organismes. Et on a compris qu'il n'y avait pas simplement quelques bactéries comme on imaginait, mais qu'il y avait une multitude de bactéries, virus, champignons. Et la grande découverte, c'était que toutes ces bactéries n'étaient pas simplement dans l'intestin, mais elles étaient partout, donc dans les cerveaux, sur la peau, dans les sangs, dans tout notre corps. Et les mots pour définir le matériel génétique de tous les micro-organismes qui habitent dans l'être humain est microbiome. Et pas simplement ça, on a compris que le potentiel génomique du microbiome, donc de tous les micro-organismes en nous, est 100 fois supérieur à celui de l'homme. Et ça, c'était un peu un choc pour moi que j'étudie l'ADN humain, parce que ça veut dire que l'ADN du microbiome est beaucoup plus important que notre propre ADN dans notre corps. Et donc, vous comprenez bien comment le paradigme a changé, parce qu'il n'y a plus un centre, l'homme n'est plus au centre de rien, la nature est hors de nous et en nous. Et donc, nous sommes la nature, en fait. Mais pour mieux comprendre l'importance des microbiomes, je vais vous donner juste quelques notions. Donc, les bactéries sont héritées exclusivement de la mère. Après, l'enfant, il va développer sa propre identité bactérienne par rapport à différents facteurs. La génétique, l'alimentation, l'environnement, les antibiotiques, etc. Et le microbiome nous accompagne dans toutes les phases de notre vie, grandit et vieillit avec nous. Mais pourquoi il est là? Quelle est sa fonction? En fait, il a 3 fonctions importantes. Il a une fonction de protection, parce qu'il va aider le système immunitaire à nous protéger. Il a une fonction structurelle, métabolique dans l'intestin, parce que dans les bébés, il aide à la formation de l'intestin et dans l'adulte, il gère la perméabilité intestinale. Et aussi, il va synthétiser des molécules clés essentielles pour la vie, comme les vitamines. Et après, il a une fonction de liaison. Il met en relation les différents organes. Et enfin, les études dans la souris qu'on appelle germ-free, ça veut dire sans micro-organismes, ont montré qu'il n'y a pas de vie sans microbiome. Les germ-free sont des souris modifiées dans les laboratoires pour ne pas avoir de micro-organismes dedans. Et les souris privées des micro-organismes ne développent pas correctement leur intestin et meurent rapidement. Donc, sans microbiome, sans micro-organismes, il n'y a pas la vie. Ces dernières années, la science s'est posé différentes questions. La première, c'était de comprendre si quand l'homme est malade, aussi le microbiome est malade, donc aussi tous les micro-organismes ensemble. Et la réponse est oui. Quand l'homme est malade, le microbiome devient malade et on l'appelle dysbiotique. Et l'autre question, c'était de comprendre si à chaque maladie correspond un profil de microbiome spécifique. Donc, si on peut définir une maladie pour un profil de micro-organismes. Et la réponse est peut-être oui, mais il y a encore beaucoup d'études à faire pour comprendre comment définir un profil de micro-organismes. Par exemple, ce soir, je vous montre une étude que j'ai publiée dans le 2018 sur la relation entre la composition bactérienne et la cirrhose, une maladie du foie. Et dans cette étude, j'ai collecté et séquencé l'ADN des bactéries, des morceaux de foie, donc biopsie hépatique, des selles et du sang, soit des personnes sans maladie, soit des personnes avec la maladie du foie. Et comme vous pouvez voir par les diagrammes camembert, la composition du microbiome est différente dans les 3 cas. Donc, les microbiomes changent quand il y a une maladie du foie. Mais ce n'est pas simplement la composition du microbiome qui est importante de regarder. En fait, avec mes collaborateurs, nous avons utilisé un algorithme pour étudier les communautés des bactéries et les relations entre les différentes bactéries, soit dans les personnes sans maladie, soit dans les patients avec la maladie du foie. Et comme vous pouvez voir, la communauté des personnes sans maladie, c'est une communauté riche, où il y a beaucoup d'espace, beaucoup d'interactions entre les différentes bactéries. Et on peut la définir en communauté harmonique, homogène. Par contre, Dans les personnes qui ont maladie de foie, la communauté est pauvre, sans beaucoup d'interactions. Donc, pour définir un profil de microbiome, il ne suffit pas de lister les espèces bactériennes qu'elles sont dedans, mais il faut aussi regarder à la communauté des bactéries et comment elle est structurée. À ce moment-là, que vous avez bien compris donc, l'importance de les vivants en nous, je voudrais vous parler d'un projet que j'ai développé à partir de 2016 et qui concerne les microbiomes hors de nous, les films invisibles des micro-organismes qu'il y a sur les bâtiments et dans les spécifiques sur les monuments. Et pour vous expliquer ce projet, je vais vous parler de comment j'ai eu l'idée. En fait, dans l'été 2016, je suis allée voir l'expo de William Cartridge sur les berges du Tibre à Rome, ma ville. Et l'artiste avait gratté la poudre noire de la pollution pour créer des images. Et en regardant l'expo, moi, je me suis posé la question où était la vie, où était la beauté, si dans les marbres blancs ou dans l'image noire. Et pour répondre à cette question, moi aussi, comme William Cartridge, j'ai gratté les berges du Tibre pour collecter des échantillons de la poudre noire et de la poudre blanche. Et j'ai commencé une collaboration avec la mairie de Rome. Nous avons publié ces résultats dans les 2020 et en fait, nous avons collecté et séquencé l'ADN de la poudre noire et de la poudre blanche pour regarder les bactéries et les champignons qu'il y avait dedans. Et ça sont un peu des résultats sur le séquençage. Les deux populations des deux poudres sont, comme attendu, très différentes. Donc, il y a des espèces différentes dans les noires et dans les blanches. Mais de nouveau, si on regarde la communauté, on comprendra encore mieux. Parce que dans la communauté noire, il y a beaucoup des espèces, bactéries et champignons sont en relation entre eux. Il y a beaucoup de liens. Si on regarde par contre dans la poudre blanche la communauté, de nouveau c'est une communauté pauvre. Il y a des populations, des petites populations et jusqu'à lien entre eux. Et en fait, quand on la regarde, on a un peu l'image d'un profil du microbiome d'une personne malade. Donc, pour répondre, oui, la vie est plutôt dans les noirs que dans les blanches. Et pour continuer sur ce sujet, ici, je vous montre un article très récent de 2021 où les auteurs ont collecté et séquencé les microbiomes, donc la communauté des bactéries, des bâtiments de 60 villes dans le monde. Et comme indiqué pour ces diapos, chaque pays a des communautés de bactéries différentes. Et ça, c'était un résultat attendu parce que chaque pays a un climat, un environnement différent. Mais le vrai résultat pour moi, c'est que dans l'article, ils vont nous montrer une autre chose. Cioè que les grandes villes ont des profils de microbiome qu'on peut définir urbains. Comme dire que quels que soient les pays d'origine dans lesquels la grande ville se trouve, les grandes villes sont très similaires entre eux. Pour mieux expliquer, c'est comme dire que Paris ressemble plus à New York ou Rome qu'à la campagne à côté. Et ça, c'est plutôt étonnant. Comment c'est possible? Parce qu'en fait, nous devons imaginer que comme les microbiomes ont un effet sur nous, sur notre santé, sur notre vie, nous, on a un effet sur les microbiomes qui sont dans l'environnement. Et donc, en voyageant, en changeant de ville, nous, comme des abeilles, nous transportons les bactéries autour de nous. Et donc, la relation qu'il y a entre nous et les micro-organismes, c'est une relation bidirectionnelle, où chacun a un effet sur l'autre. Et ça, si c'est un concept un peu difficile à comprendre, on peut imaginer le Covid, parce que c'est ça qu'on nous montré. Cioè le rôle qu'a eu l'homme dans la transmission du virus pendant la pandémie. Donc, c'est un peu ça le concept. Et donc, on est parti en étudiant l'homme tout seul, isolé dans la nature, pour comprendre que ce n'est pas possible de définir l'homme isolé de son environnement. Et finalement, il y a un nouveau paradigme, parce qu'il n'y a plus un centre, il n'y a plus l'homme au centre de rien, et on peut dire que nous, on a un écosystème où la nature, les micro-organismes, et nous, on est tout le temps en train de changer d'une manière bidirectionnelle. Et donc, vraiment, les mots devenus très importants dans la biologie est le mot de l'interrelation. Et donc, vraiment, pour terminer, sachant tout cela, je voulais terminer avec une question que je pose à moi-même comme scientifique, que je pose à vous comme architecte. Donc, sachant tout cela, que le vivant invisible est en dehors de nous et en nous, comment prendre en compte cette information? Comment on peut imaginer notre vie ensemble?
Bon, je me lance en anglais. Donc, voilà, c'était. Merci beaucoup pour cette intervention précise, très intéressante parce que ça aborde plusieurs thématiques. Donc, j'aurai pas mal de questions. Ce qu'on pourrait faire parce qu'il y a un switch qu'on va faire en 3 niveaux. Premier switch, c'est un switch d'écran. Deuxième switch, c'est un switch de langue parce que la prochaine présentation est en anglais. Et le troisième switch, c'est un switch de thématique parce que là, on passe du microbiome à des sphères du vivant, des non-humains, on va dire un peu plus grands. Mais bon, qui ont déjà des pattes, qui ont déjà des organes un peu plus considérables. Alors, je ne sais pas si on peut... On se lance avec le deuxième Si vous voulez poser des questions, n'hésitez pas. Si vous voulez qu'elle revienne sur certains éléments. On sait bien, il y a quelque chose qui est assez intéressant dans cette expérience qu'on est en train d'avoir aujourd'hui, c'est la question de l'interdisciplinarité. C'est vrai que la première question qu'on peut se poser, c'est en quoi ce qu'elle vient de nous présenter peut nous aider à penser l'architecture autrement. Alors, ça, c'est une première question, peut-être qui serait intéressant. Peut-être c'est un point sur lequel tu pourrais revenir un peu. Cette manière dont tu as commencé toi-même à te nourrir de certains éléments qui ne sont pas propres à ta discipline, qui est une discipline assez lourde, assez dure, assez de base, comme on dit en Italie, fondamentale. Voilà, je ne sais pas si tu peux nous raconter un peu comment ça s'est passé, cette rencontre avec ces cas.
Pour moi, c'était lié vraiment à mon milieu, à le séquençage d'ADN. Donc, j'ai commencé à séquencer l'ADN des micro-organismes. À ce moment-là, je me suis rendu compte, comme je dis dans les diapos, que c'était quelque chose de vraiment étonnant parce qu'il changeait complètement les points de vue. Parce que pour moi, le point central dans la maladie, en étudiant l'homme, c'était vraiment l'ADN. Donc, on a parlé pour des années de l'ADN comme la chose plus importante pour comprendre l'être humain. Et finalement, quand j'ai vu qu'il y avait des autres micro-organismes qui géraient notre propre ADN, c'est là que j'ai changé un peu tout et j'ai commencé à voir des micro-organismes un peu partout. Parce que c'était tellement fascinant d'échanger les points de vue que c'est pour ça aussi que je me suis posé la question sur le bâtiment. Parce que c'était quelque chose que je regarde tout le temps et finalement, maintenant, quand je regarde un bâtiment, aussi s'il n'y a pas personne, je trouve qu'il n'est pas vide. Parce qu'il est quand même habité pour des micro-organismes, pour la nature. Donc, bon, ça, c'était...
Merci. Je crois qu'on enchaîne et peut-être qu'on pourrait revenir sur... So, we're gonna switch to the next presentation. Do you hear us? It's good? Okay. So...
Yes. Hi.
So, okay, because the screen is kind of fixed. No, it's good. It's good. So, can you share screen? You have to share the screen.
Yeah. I will share the screen. Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Okay.
1 second. Can you see?
Okay, it's perfect.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you. We hear us. No, there's a problem. There's a problem with your screen. In fact,
I cannot hear you.
Yeah, there's a problem with your screen. In fact, there is a screen from. This is not your presentation. Yeah. Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yeah. Now it works.
You see it, right? So you see it as a full page.
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Fantastic.
Let's go.
Okay, then I guess I can just start. So thank you so much for the invitation. Also, like in combination with Francesca, and just a few words about us. So, like I'm Alessandra, and I lead the studio Ossidiana together with Giovanni Bellotti. We are based in Rotterdam. And in our studio, we work across the different scales, like through materials, objects, public spaces, and buildings. And today, I would like to share some recent projects and address like a few themes that are quite important for us, not only in themselves, but also because they reflect how we work and how we structured the studio. So actually, before diving into the project, I just wanted to go through these themes. So like something that is quite important for us is the work or the relation with public space. And like we look at public space as a privileged terrain for experimentation. And we see it as a space which should not strive for neutrality, but rather towards action, a place where to invent games, or play games, a place that actually should be somewhat fearful of conformism, a place where you could cook or cultivate. So usually, like we look at public spaces not as a homogeneous surfaces or neutral background to things, but as a place where we discover different ways of being a citizen, not only as a consumer or as a user, but as an explorer. And then also like something that is quite important for us is to look at public space as the place of encounter between different groups of people, but also between people and other animals, minerals. So yeah, as a place where to confront some of our collective fears and ambitions, not only as individuals, but as a society. And I would like, explain a little bit more this kind of projects that relate with this kind of human and the non-human theme that maybe also connect a bit to like the presentation of Francesca. Then another, something that is quite important for us is also like materiality, the exploration of materiality. So we're really fascinated by the transformation of matter into materials. And like we think that materials can embody narratives, they always tell stories. And then we look at projects as one of the tools through which we could rethink material culture within the discipline of architecture. And like we do different types of experiments, especially with casting and with terrazzo. And we've been working through the years with different mixtures, so from traditional terrazzo with stones to contextual terrazzo that is embedding ingredients or textures from a certain place, or horticultural composites with charcoal, expanded clay, seeds and soil that are meant to be transformed and become soil, bonded with the compression with clay or lime. So there is this kind of idea of domestication of matter into material and then become matter again. So, and then, yeah, this desire for materiality of things also inform the way we work and we design and our process. So we make many models and material samples for almost every project. And this is something very important for us because it allows us to give agency to the work beyond the confines of a screen. So before they become built. So sometimes the projects don't go through or don't lead to next iterations, but through a model, for us, it continues to exist. so that the project reminds us what it could have been, or talks about other possible future and different possibilities. So making the model is not just a means towards a completed project, but for us is a project in itself that we can explore, we can look at, that somehow looks back at us, and is also something that we need to take care of, literally maintain, restore, modify, transport, store. So in this sense, the scalability of the model extends beyond the metrical scale and into the practice of taking care of things, of curating them, as for a building or pavilion or garden. And like most of our work is rather small scale, so installations, objects, pavilions, or like small buildings, but the imaginary it draws from and the context this project belongs to, like for us, is territorial. And then we see projects as fragments, and in fact, all being in a way like one project, with models, materials, installations, buildings, all scattered, but one. And actually, Ossidiana initially started as a project more than as a practice. And somehow this has remained. So the studio is one of the tools to make projects. And today I would like to present like 5 projects. And I would like to start with one that is actually the less recent. And that is called Amsterdam Allegories. And basically, it's the least recent of the work we want to show tonight. And with this, we won the Prix de Rome in 2018, but still it's a very important project for us because it was a manifesto, not only towards the outside. So basically, like a project to communicate our position as architects, but actually because it was a manifesto for ourselves. So with the project, we developed a series of themes and methods that then became or were developed into other projects. And it was also like the beginning of working with models and materials that have an agency on their own. And it was also a project that works at the scale of the city and the territory and the scale of the island. So it could be understood more as a port, as an embassy, rather than as a master plan. And so the Prix de Rome in the Netherlands comes like out like in the form of a competition, and the jury gave a site, which is a 6-7. And for the one that are like familiar with Amsterdam, 6-7 is a triangular site just opposite to the central station, and it's a triangle in the map. And it's a really fascinating place with an incredible history, and it's a piece of infrastructure of the 19th century. And a lock on the North Holland Canal. So it was basically a piece of infrastructure that was connecting the port of Amsterdam all the way to the Nelder, which is this town in the north of the Netherlands. It was an alternative route to the Zuiderzee for the transport of goods from all over the world, when the access to the city of Amsterdam was actually not from the North Sea, but from the inner sea of the Netherlands. And today is one of the few places that are still undeveloped, right in the center of the city. And so it has become the dream of developers. And and Amsterdam traditionally, so Amsterdam city center historically and traditionally has always looked south. So the Eye Canal was not the facade of the city, rather it was the port, was the place where gods got in. But as Piet Blumen predicted, the Eye, like it's becoming the Grand Canal of Amsterdam. And 6-7 is right in the middle of this transformation. So it's becoming the geographical center of this new city around the Eye. Okay. And so basically, like for 6-7, we imagined, or for this kind of very center of the future city, we imagined a place for new experimental public space, like a civic port that would host a fleet of 21 floating islands, docked in 6-7, but also free to be transported and anchored within Amsterdam's territory. And we imagine the islands as a place that it could be explored and cultivated, where to cook, climb, bath, each embassy of other Amsterdams. So the one of the port, of the warehouse, of the polders. So like basically an alternative or a way to confront the bold but somewhat sterile language of the icons, or the cliche of the fancy waterfronts with hysterical ships, or the supposedly neutral vocabulary of public space, where when limited to the rows of trees, benches, and cafes. So we imagine the islands as places for actions, so where forms and materials would be allegory of the past and present of the city in this expanded territory. So it would be inspired both by historical palace and floating baths that used to inhabit the shores of the Eye, or Baroque Lustoven, pleasure gardens of Amsterdam merchants, but also actually elements of the port, so like heaps of coal or heaps of sand or metal scraps or the fumes of the chimneys of the factory and of the polders of the waterland. And then like we started imagining that these islands would be accessible only by boat. And then we started seeing water as a democratic surface, an unknown territory for everybody, where there are no beaten paths. So water enhances encounters, and water we're closer to fellow humans. A bit like when we walk on a mountain train, when we say hi because of pleasure, but also for precaution to make our presence known in an environment in which we are like foreigners, guests. And then as we began to design and then think and build models of these islands in our office, each became a project in itself. So in a way, the project was a process of composition of stories, architectures, and ideas of nature that as we proceeded began to communicate with each other and to suggest new encounters. And now I will go through like some of these, like a few of these islands. And this is like the Shore Island, which is a tribute to the Dutch coast, like a thought on the relation between the city and the territory, but also on the relation between leisure and fear. So it reflects both on coastal erosion, sea level rise, but it also wants to convey a certain optimism. It's a vast sandpit from which roofs and chimneys emerge that can be dug, excavated, a place that can also be farmed, where soil can be made, a sand garden. Or the Black Mountain, which is a floating embassy of the coal peaks of the port downstream, but also a site for barbecues and adventurous campfires. Or the Palace of Water, which is dedicated to the swimming on the Eye, which is like a floating memory of the Obelt bathhouse that used to be an open-air pool that was on the north shore of the Eye, that now becomes a place where to swim alongside fishes and plants. A floating Turkish baths, heated by the collective effort of several independent fires. A garden, of course, for agricultural, spontaneous, and ornamental plants and their cultural and botanical intersection, or a floating aviary to reflect and rethink the cultural categories we use to approach other animals. And we thought of the islands as places where, at the very least, the different social groups can cross paths, share space, but also as places where Amsterdam citizens meet other species, a place to cultivate a more nuanced relation with nature, a place that offers possibilities of encounter between humans and other animals, plants, and minerals, and where the citizens of Amsterdam would meet embassies of the territory they inhabit, so the fluxes of water, the migratory birds, the heaps of materials on the shore, or some lost or forgotten elements of the city architecture. And the island, beside being harbored in Sixth Haven, could also move across the city, creating new, unexpected, estranging, or familiar encounters with other figures of the landscape. So in this case, in this image, like the coal mountain is meeting the Silo Dam, or in this case, like our recreated mountain for barbecues is meeting the regional coal mountain in the port. And with Amsterdam allegories, we wanted to celebrate like the messiness of the shore over the sanitized sleekness of the waterfront, or the unpredictability of the encounter over the vanity of the architectural statement, or the supposed boldness of the architectural icon. And with this project, we wanted to imagine a space where citizen would no longer be seen as user or consumer, but as sailors, as gardeners, as farmers, as collectors, cartographers, or explorers. And this was a very, very important project for us, both in terms of process, of themes, of methods, of ways of representation. So it's still the base for many projects that we are doing now, like starting from the research approach, or the interest in typology, the process of working with models as operative objects, which are for us always one-to-one objects in themselves, but also representation of other scales. And now I would like to go through another project that also it was also actually one of the first projects we worked on after Amsterdam Allegories, and it was built actually exactly like 1 year ago. And it was initially developed for the city of Almere in the Netherlands, where we were commissioned to design a public space for a fireplace on the beach a couple of years ago. And Almere is a new town in Flevoland, and Flevoland is the newest region of the Netherlands, so that emerged through the biggest reclamation project worldwide. So it used to be the Zuiderzee, the inner sea of the Netherlands. And then in this kind of very flat horizontal landscape, we started looking for mountains. So from the dunes that protect the country to the sea, to the sand that is transported on barges, to the heaps of sand around construction sites. So it's a landscape we were seeing emerging in many different places. And we started to recognize almost as a genre of landscape. Then in the meantime, the world changed. Almere doesn't have budget anymore, but our photographic collection of heaps keeps growing. And 1 year after, Rome, which is an association from Utrecht, invites us to think of an installation in their space. And then when we visited, it was this kind of vast inhabited construction site when we find other landscapes of dunes, heaps of sand, earth, and bricks, and we remain quite fascinated. Also because like our impression of the Netherlands is one of a country maintained like a sheep. But here we find like a contemporary wilderness. And then we think that between the artificial dunes of Almere and the temporary ones of Utrecht, there is not such a big difference because they're all dredged, sand is all dredged from the sea. And the project of the territory is the same, a country whose energy is fully oriented towards rebuilding itself. So again, we started collecting images of fires, stoves, chimneys, campfires. So like from the collective rituals of open air fires to domestic chimneys, times rooms dedicated to the fire, big enough to be inhabited. Or we're fascinated by this kind of large stoves, which are this kind of warm macro objects that can be bed, oven, kitchen, between architecture, furniture, and a model of a building. So our project became a series of variations on the fireplace, a portal, a kitchen, a scenographic wall with a crater on top with different orientations to protect from the wind, which becomes a dune as it's covered in sand, and the dune itself is heated by its fireplace. And so it's a sort of geological stove made of sand where fireplaces heats the room and the sand itself as the fires are lit, and offers places to cook between the dunes. And we did a series of variations of the project from one large fire dune to a landscape of dunes. And we really love to work with this type of models where the material, in this case, sand and steel, is both one-to-one and representation. And so they become immediately this kind of small world to explore, so they become operative. And we also took photos of the model by night. This is the main fire room, the portal in the model. And this is the project last year when we lit the fires for the first time. And we tried the barbecue, and we cooked here for the first time. And it looked almost like a sand cave, especially by night. We also tested the oven with some pizzas. There were a Dutch chef, and the pizza was not amazing, but still they didn't give default to our ovens. And then with this project, we tried to create a public space that could bring together the domestic intimate scale of the domestic kitchen and the collective one of the campfire. And in the meantime, the landscape around the surrounding change again. It becomes surrounded by buildings that observes the dunes as it was a strange guest in the garden, a memory of the past heaps. And then it became quite lively over time. Every time we were going there were like people inhabiting these places in many different ways. And it kept sending smoke signals across the square, visible from the train station from afar. And then we also took some photos of the installation with a photographer we collaborate with called Riccardo De Vecchi. And most of the photos that you see are by him. And yeah, these photos are quite important for us because they show architecture not as something fixed, but as something moving that changes shape and gives the idea of working on the model one-to-one. So in a way, when we were on the construction site, it felt like the same process and materials of our small model, but just with a different equipment. Then we went a few times to see it. It was never the same. And one evening we found a camper parked in front of it with a couple warming up in front of the fire, burning the ashes of the fire before going to bed. And so it was this kind of something between a landscape, a kitchen, and a playground. And it became this kind of large landscape to explore and climb, and where to do acrobatic jumps on sand from the top volcano. So it was a project made of sand, but also actually made of footprints, shells, traces of fires, a smell of food cooking, or blogs and sand burning. And then as the project is mostly made of sand, like which becomes a material through its use, and it makes no sense without actions. And now I would like to move from Almere, Utrecht, back to Amsterdam. And I would like to show a project that is called the Bird Palace, which is an installation we installed in Vondelpark, the main park of Amsterdam this summer, which is a floating garden for birds and bird watchers. But before diving into this project, I wanted to contextualize it a bit. And so we have a bit of history with birds. So we won't go into depth tonight because it could be a lecture on its own. But like I just want to share that a bit of this research, which is so for a while we've been interested in spaces like bird cages, zoos, aviaries, but also bird feeders, dovecotes, bat towers, a collection of mediative objects that we call mediative objects, through which we negotiate the space with other animals, in particular with birds. And this research has been it started with Giovanni's postgrad thesis at MIT in Boston, and then evolved through different projects. It took many different names. It was exhibited at Institute in Rotterdam, but at the Venice Biennale, and it's still a project we are working on. And we are particularly interested in birds because birds carry metaphors in every culture, perhaps more than any other species. They connect the ground and the sky, they're between heaven and earth. But also, birds are very literally like the greatest force behind the globalization of nature along with humans. As they disperse season through adaptation and migration, they exist in every corner of the planet. And they're always around us, always very close, even within us in a way. So in the sense that imitation of birds per season probably leads to every form of music and language. But of course, they are also completely remote from us, 40 million years of evolution away. And this is a research we developed through different projects and prototypes and models, where we began to collect, design, sometimes modify or interpret models of cages or aviaries that and we did this by making models at different scales. And again, models are a powerful tool for us because they capture restrictions between the scales that are always objects in themselves, as well as form of representations, a bit like zoos or aviaries, which are also representations of an idea of the world and a piece of it at the same time. So again, also this collection of models were becoming for us a collection and a series of mediative objects, showing cages in the broad sense of the word through which we negotiate the space with other animals. And then the projects also took different forms. So for example, this is some furniture that Giovanni made during the lockdown, during quarantine. When back in Rotterdam, we found ourselves working from the studio without the team, with the only company of our parrot, Coco. So actually this work about birds and this research is not only academic or professional for us, but it's also quite personal. And Coco is a 2 years old Monoratrix from Rijswijk, which is close to Den Haag. And so we designed this furniture and this seat and bench for him and us, which are variations of the Windsor benches designed to accommodate us together. And or for example, we developed a platform for humans and birds with games, seats for birds to pick, that was also exhibited in a larger version at the Venice Biennale, also inhabited by perches and eatable materials, but also together with our models, and alongside a pigeon tower that we designed for a flock of Venetian pigeons, which was actually dedicated to pigeons, which for us is an exceptional family of birds with a spectrum of relations that to people ranges from agriculture, communication to leisure and farming, because there are animals that are completely designed by people tied to wars, politics, economy, that today somehow are unnecessary, kept for racing or display, but mainly regarded as a sort of urban nuisance. And so we build like basically this kind of tower that tribute and shelter to the species, and was a sort of became this bird tower chimera. So it's dressed like a bird with a big gutter and a bird feet overseeing and hosting a flock of Venetian pigeon. And now, like after having contextualized this, I would like to go a little bit more in depth on the bird palace, the project I mentioned before, which we realized this summer. And the bird palace is a floating garden that was anchored in one of Vondel Park pond, and is like a space for the encounter between birds, native and non-native, feral and wild, and the people of Amsterdam. So residents, commuters, but also students and tourists. And it's a floating island that to be explored by means of bird watching, picking between the canopies of trees or bushes, or to be observed from the shore with the support of binoculars or cameras. And it's imagined like as a contemporary public Sluisdorf, which used to be pleasure gardens of Amsterdam Golden Age, enclosed and often only accessible by boat, which were reserved for nobility. And our floating garden is dotted by tall perches and bird feeders that will also look like abstract birds with beaks to nest in or bellies full of seeds. And as the garden was installed, the first courageous duck went in exploration, eventually deciding to venture inside, discovering the large buffet. And then slowly the island was inhabited by other water birds. And for example, Egyptian geese found their spot to dry their feathers after a swim, and then they were followed by pigeons. And we noticed that magpies and crows were a bit more cautious. They first observed for a while before going on board. And the idea was that perches and bird feeders would emerge from a heap of fertile soil. And as birds would feed, play, and deposit guano on their heap, they would disperse seeds and in this way fertilize the ground, becoming the gardeners of the floating island. And so the idea was to imagine an installation which visitors could never really reach, that would only be accessible to birds, but also to people if they committed to become observers, so bird watchers, keeping the distance, enjoying a sort of timid relation based on seeing and being seen. And as the garden pivots on the water, becomes a sort of inverted panopticon where birds are observed, where people are observed by birds, and where people are not absent, but somehow out of the center of the map. And I would like now there are other two projects I would like to show. And this one is called Three Floating Rooms, and is our project for a small museum for land art and multimedia, again in Almere, in Flevoland, that will open in the context of Floriade, which is this kind of very large horticultural expo that in every 10 years is in the Netherlands. And this year, like the master plan was designed by MVRDV. And so we won the competition in November 2020, so a little bit, like more than a year ago. And the construction is almost finished, so actually it will open in next week. And as a fire dune, the site of the project is Flevoland. So it's, as I was mentioning, is this kind of latest province of the Netherlands that was transformed over the 20th century from the sea into new land. So it was this kind of largest engineering effort of the past century. And Floriade is also in itself a new land. So it's part of this extension within the lake of Almere called Verwater, which means water again. And the process for us began and continued over the past year as a discovery of the landscape of Flevoland. So islands that belong to the sea became mainland as Cockland, or new islands enclosing lakes of dredged silt started containing new forms of nature. And then we started looking also at other figures inhabiting the landscape, like Flevoland has this kind of large collection of land art projects that were built in the 70s and in the 80s, and that we really started seeing as this new acts of foundation of this new land, or as new shores. And then in this landscape, variations on the language of lightweight glass palaces emerge. And in this new nature, there are also new inhabitants of the place, not only humans, so minerals and animals which have arrived together with people, cattle and plants. So we began to think of the museum as a sequence of characters, each working as a frame. And the first one is the port, which is like what we call the port, like a circle premium waters, a disc to be created and cultivated where plants can be gardened and actions performed. And the second one is a platform, which is a terrace of the museum, which is both a terrace and a stage where performances could be held. And then there is the museum pavilion, which is a third circle on water that is docked tangentially to the ring. And the pavilion is a lightweight cylindrical structure which encloses its exhibition rooms like a floating greenhouse. And the museum offers two main indoor exhibition rooms. And in this way, the circular pier frames a third vast room, an enclosure that can also be curated and cultivated. So these are the three characters that make the museum. And for us, what was important was, we really wanted to propose a new type of museum that could offer different possibilities for creating exhibitions and for cultivating water, a system of indoor and outdoor frames. So we thought of the Museum of Land Art and Multimedia in Flevoland as something that could give the possibility to display, interact, and perform on water, that could work as a port for art, but also quite literally as a port where boats or other floating installation could dock in its outer perimeter or inhabit its enclosed pond. And then we started imagining different curatorial possibilities from a water courtyard, maybe like a collection of water plants or a collection of floating treatment wetlands. And we started thinking about as the pier, as the port, where other boats could moor there, following the example of exhibition spaces. So there could be barges filled with plants or heaps of soils, or maybe houseboats for artist residencies. So we started imagining different ways of presenting artworks. And this is the position where the pavilion is located within the main square and the Canal of Floriade. And so the first room, as I was mentioning, is the pier that is imagined as a port. Then the pavilion is imagined as an observatory, and which has a very simple design with services on a core and circulation on the side. So to keep experiencing the loop of the circle from the square to the pier to the exhibition rooms and over again. And the pavilion is oriented on a north-south axis with openings marking celestial alignments. So there are windows that are looking at dawn and dusk during the solstice of winter and summer, while the roof is covered with shells that was filtering rainwater, but also as a sort of dish, like a buffet for the birds of Floriade. And the pier is divided in 12 elements, which are also the 12 months. They have different terrazzo insertions, becoming a calendar of harvest of shells. So the project is a planetarium in the observatory and a more caloric marine calendar in the port. And we developed a special materials research for this project to be used as insertions on the pier and on the floor of the observatory. And we called it surf and turf, which is also this dish that is made with food from the sea and from land, and in this case is a terrazzo that is made with both materials of the sea and of land, so mussels and other shells, and expanded clay, sand, charcoal, and an earth-based pigment. So in a way, like this terrazzo is also petrifying materials of the region into this kind of new mineral floor. And an inspiration was also this Roman typology of mosaic that is called azarotosoikos, which means unswept floor, where remains of food, shells, and so on were represented, all this kind of food that was thrown on the floor after a banquet. So we really loved it, and that we started imagining somehow that this surf and turf terrazzo could belong to this mosaic genre. And here you can see some of the photos of the process and the shells that we used for the terrazzo to define these different shells of the mixture. So we organized actually several dinners with the terrazzo artisans to collect all these seashells and as materials for the terrazzo. And then for every project, we realize we make the first samples and iterations in our studio, and then we scale up when we have to scale up the project, we collaborate with the artisans. And these are some of our last tests that for the counter at the entrance of the observatory. And these one are some samples for the pier, but they were collected based on the season. So this one, for example, is January with oysters, sea snails, and razor clams, or July with razor clams and mussels, and the December. And this one is the mix of shells. And this is just one of the samples. And it looks a little bit like cooking. And this is the polishing. So it's when we remove this kind of first patina of cement, and then it's almost like an archaeological process. We really enjoy being there actually when our objects or materials are being polished, because we start seeing all this kind of world of shells or other materials emerging. And it's also something that we love to control, because if you polish too much, suddenly maybe things that you really like to just disappear. So here the shells are emerging. And here there is this kind of mixture of clams, blue mussels, razor clams, and oysters. And here some of the samples drying outside. And we also exhibited like a collection of these objects and materials during the Dutch Design Week. And also as models, materials are also representation and research, but also one-to-one objects. And for example, some of the material samples also became book holders, or shaped as heaps, or we even made a chess piece, like a game, so a sort of surf and turf, so like a sort of chess piece of sea against land. And these one are like some of the competition images. So we envisioned the pond almost as the main room of the museum, inhabited by art, people, and other species. When you could reach the pavilion by boat from the canal, or you could observe the sculptures within this water square, but also swim together, like between the sculptures, or in very cold winters, like the water might freeze, becoming a skating ring. And the museum could be circumnavigated like a large buoy, and at night could glow like a lantern. And so that's one were the images that we presented for the competition. And then, of course, we had to start working with changing representation as soon as we started presenting not only to the jury, but to developers, to the municipality, and different parties. And then by night, figures of the facade would emerge from the building, creating a new facade. And the walls inside are made in semi-transparent polycarbonate and wrapped by a curtain, where cutout shapes allow light to filter through in different ways. So different kind of forms emerge on the facade. So it's a facade only designed by light, framing openings, and openings new views on the water. And so the project, these are some images of the construction site, and of the exhibition space facing north. So actually, like the pavilion in these images was waiting for the second layer of polycarbonate. But still we wanted to achieve like a sort of transparency to start seeing the colors or the lights outside the pavilion. And then since one room, like the exhibition room, is facing north, there is a really like a very different colors or lights in the two rooms. So this is the north, and this is the south facade at dawn. And this is Wesley, the terrazzo artisan, working with a mix of shells. So it was like basically the same process of working on a sample, but at a little bit larger scale. And these one are the photos once polished, when it was still a bit wet. And here when it's dry, just like a few, just last week. And these one are some images of the ring with that were still waiting, like these one are the niches for the terrazzo insertions, and a view from the square or from the terrace. So it's the first building that we are realizing, and like after a continuous work on the circle, a cycle of simplification and complication, it seemed that has returned to the first small concrete model that we made in our studio during the competition. So like a port, the terrace, the room of water, and the internal space protected by a greenhouse. So basically 3 rooms to live in, set up, care for, and cultivate. This one is the last project that I would like to present, and it's called Buyukada Songlines, and it's a project that was developed for the Istanbul Design Biennial following an invitation by Mariana Pestana, the curator. And Buyukada Songlines is a floating garden that we designed to cruise the waters of Marmara and the Bosphorus, connecting Istanbul's Prince Islands with the city's Asian and European shores. So we would like to take you on a short photographic journey of the project, but before I get there, I would like to share some thoughts behind the project. So in these images, in this slide, you can see some miniatures from Ottoman era, and it shows a selection of floating pavilions, which in different times inhabited the waters of Istanbul. So for us, it's a project that works within a certain tradition of architecture that is certainly not exclusive to a culture or a place. And so we began to think of it as a tradition which binds many water cities. And so we all know the Teatro del Mondo by Aldo Rossi, where he combined the early Renaissance Florentine kiosk and theaters, Elizabethan theaters, lighthouse architecture, but also 18th century Venetian architecture and its floating structures for the carnival. Or Robert Smithson's proposal for a floating island that realized only after its death, floating around Manhattan. So it's a tradition that belongs more to water rather than to a specific culture or place. And one of which for us is powerful, not as just a special archetype, the ship or the island, but as a device for narration. So a tradition of stories told on waters, from Homer to Conrad, Stevenson to Le Guin, but also Aldo Rossi and Robert Smithson. And just a bit about the context. So Istanbul is an incredible town of 20 million inhabitants between Asia and Europe at the convergence of waters. And the islands, the 9 islands, the Princess Island are 5 meters off the Asian coast, and you can see them in the bottom of the image. And there are incredible, fascinating places that have been places of exile and retreat, inhabited for millennia. So it was a place of exile for Ottoman royalty, but were also places where Trotsky fled after leaving Soviet Russia before finding his end in Mexico. He was living in Buyukada, the largest of the islands. And then, in these islands, that have an incredible history that encompasses not only about humans, but also we found incredible stories also about this kind of multi-species, more than human. And then we began to imagine Buyukada songlines in this context. So a project that somehow echoes Chatwin's diaries of the Aboriginal songlines, where other definitions of territories emerge not as lines on a map, but through the knowledge of stories, music, plants, and minerals. And so this one is the route that we followed, a bit erratic, as the barge moved through the archipelago, so coming from the Asian shores, heading towards the European coast of Marmara before returning to the islands. And this one was our garden, docked on the commercial port of Buyukada, waiting to sail off in July. And we were greeted by a rather surprised captain. And so the project was really the design of a journey, a curated travel across the island's stories and ecologies. And like a floating embassy, the floating garden collected plants, artifacts, matter, and stories from the 9 islands. And at every stop became a public space. And where conversations, recording, and materials will build this physical and immaterial collection, which is both curated through events and quite literally cultivated. So academics, fishermen, divers, researchers joined on top, and conversations were held on the very waters they seek to describe and transform, flickering between the context of the water, soils, and animals, and their humans' abstractions and metaphors. And as I was mentioning with Amsterdam allegories, on water empathy is heightened between people, as the more experienced sailor helps the novice, or the boat in distress signals to other vessels. So water is a place of leisure and of fear, foreign to all, where routes are determined by plants as much as they are by the weather. And again, also in this project, water, we felt it was a democratic surface where rules are determined by wind, maneuverability, and assess at each encounter. So on water, distinctions between locals and tourists, native and foreigner fade. Everybody becomes a traveler. So the garden became an observatory through which we were framing different islands. So this one is the island of Neandros, which is said to be uninhabited, but actually is home of a huge colony of cormorants. Or here on our way towards Edibeliada, which was a source of copper and iron already in Roman times. And we use the pigments of this island as iron oxide for our platform. Or Sivriada in the distance, which also has an incredible story, like in 1911, 80,000 dogs were abandoned after being captured in the streets of Istanbul and left there to die in exile. Or yes, Yada, which was a place where politicians and academics following the 1960 coup were trialed and sentenced. And this is like the garden, and as it traveled, it hosted human travelers ourselves with different guests. We recorded interviews and conversations, but also other non-human passengers like gulls and crows were taking a lift along with butterflies, bees, and ants that were traveling from island to island. And eventually the island was towed towards the mainland. And here we were approaching the Golden Horn, and we started seeing the minarets of the Blue Mosque and Hagia Sophia in the distance, and the mosques of Yenikani and Suleiman. And we were about to pass beneath the Galata Bridge before docking in Alice. And we stayed in the Golden Horn for around 6 weeks before returning to the islands, and where the garden left behind all the plants and the installations, and now it's permanently installed in one of Buyukata's garden. And as I was saying here, the project and the design lies in designing a form of hospitality, and to work on how one could address the scale of the territory, of the sea, of the migration of people and animal by working with fragments. So the barge, we think it allows to speak of the context it is immersed in, the water it touches, the shores it sees, but also of other places, other waters it has been immersed in or could travel to. So it's a fragment of the world which can be a place of both representation, narration, and action. Thank you. So the presentation, ending here.
So thank you very much for your presentation. That is quite beautiful, the images.
I cannot hear you.
No, sorry. So thank you very much for your presentation, for this project that are really exciting, quite exciting. So I think that I will be the first to ask a question, and it's about the first project, Amsterdam Allegories. I think that is a project that's really powerful. It's kind of a manifesto, like you said. So I would like to know, I have perhaps two questions. The first one is, I think that there is a material condition, which is, by the way, which is different between the model and the thing. I don't know if you have different status for the material condition of a model and the construction. But anyway, there is a material condition that questions the way that an architect imagines or can create some kind of stories or rituals or architectural rituals or acts of foundation. So I would like to know if there is a change between the way that you create some kind of stories and the way that other architects imagines these kind of stories. And the second question is about the status of the citizens, of the people that live in your projects. You said that your aim was to build some kind of citizens, of gardeners, of farmers. That will be no more citizens, but perhaps gardeners and farmers. And I would like to know if you thought about the status or the political status of the animals that are going to be inhabiting your projects. I don't know if it's clear what I said.
I think, I mean, I'm just taking notes. And I'm just thinking how to answer to this like beautiful questions. Let me think. I mean, maybe about this kind of I think the first question was about the relation between the material status of our models and the storytelling of or what these models or objects would convey. So something that for us was quite important when we were doing the project is to create models. I mean, it was an architectural competition, but we really wanted to find a new language to express our idea. We didn't want to work with traditional maquettes, and was very important that our models would be almost as conversation pieces. So it's what I was trying to explain about the models being operative objects rather than just, like just a maquette that you finish and you present the project at the end with. And then to do that, in order to do that, for us, it was essential and super important that like also the materiality could tell or could be expressive, to suggest or to hint stories. And then there were the stories that obviously we suggested, but there were also the stories that could come up in the viewer, or like the people that would look at it and would start imagine or relate or build up other stories. So yeah, I think this is exactly what we found extremely powerful in building and realizing these type of models that could really like open up different ways of imagining what a city could be. And the materiality of it is also obviously a part of it. So like also for this process, we work with casting. And for us, it's quite important to always work with real materials, a little bit like as we did for the fire dune. That we didn't work with casting, but the sand and the metal was really like one-to-one, or in other projects. So these kind of platforms that we cast, or the piers of the Kunst Pavilion, of this art pavilion. There was always a relation between the materialization of.
And perhaps it's the same thing with color, because you have a way to use colors that is really precise.
Yeah, exactly, and that also related to the materialization, because like since we cast in the models, we use plaster or cement in the real, like in the platform or in the pavilion, and then it's basically a very similar process. It's working with casting, and we use pigments, and pigments can only achieve a certain amount of saturation. So that basically this kind of palette is also coming from there, from like working with the material. So I hope this will answer the first question.
The second one is
let's say that also in Amsterdam, I mean, about the political status.
Yes.
Sorry, no,
in fact, the second one is because I think that there is all these kind of debates here in France and everywhere else about the status of the animal in a urban context, for example. So I don't know if you thought about this kind of status.
Yeah, we were not thinking necessarily at legal entities. I mean, we're working now also on projects that like give or would give look at animals or plants or minerals as a sort of different separate legal entities. So that would allow but in Amsterdam allegories, I think was not there yet. But obviously we started. I mean, I didn't show all the islands because there were like 21. But there we also started imagining this kind of tall perches for migratory birds where you could, like by boat, you could sail across, or there was this island with sheep that would a little bit like in the polders, they would graze the grass, but also like a bit of the origin of the English lawn with the sheep. And then this one was also connected to a project that at the same time Giovanni was developing at in Boston. It was a floating aviary, and all this research about humans and birds, and somehow all these kind of things were like there, were in our mind, even though maybe it was not extremely explicit in Amsterdam allegories, but was also there somehow.
Okay, thank you. Des questions, voilà, vous pouvez poser des questions en anglais, en français, tout est bienvenu. Marie, je ne sais pas, non? Personne ne veut se lancer? Tout le monde est aplati, oui.
Merci. Oui, merci pour ces deux très belles présentations. Francesca, c'est une question un petit peu... Je crois que le mot, j'ai entendu le mot harmonie. Alors c'est un mot qui est très connoté, en tout cas dans l'histoire de l'architecture. Il y a tout un registre. Et du coup, je voulais savoir, est-ce que tu l'envisageais d'un point de vue dans le registre scientifique dans lequel tu travailles? Ou est-ce que, enfin, quel est le sens de ce mot vis-à-vis de ce que tu as décrit?
Mais bon, j'ai utilisé le mot harmonique parce que harmonique, oui, aussi dans la science, ça veut dire quelque chose qui est un peu homogène, où il n'y a pas de grandes différences. Et donc, en fait, quand on regarde la communauté des bactéries, on la définit harmonique, ça veut dire qu'il n'y a pas un centre, que toutes les espèces bactériennes sont importantes un comme les autres. Et pour moi, quand je le regarde, c'est disharmonique. Quand on regarde qu'il y a vraiment des différences très grandes et donc qu'il n'y a plus un centre, qu'il y a des petits centres. Et ça devient, oui, un peu aussi de la science, on la défend comme ça.
Oui, parce qu'en fait, on avait eu cette discussion sur la question, bon, je ne sais pas si vous voyez la question de l'anthropocentrisme, comment l'architecture est face à ce nouvel enjeu, finalement, de comment repenser, voire même des formes architecturales, voire même une théorie architecturale qui ne soit pas forcément anthropocentrée, ce qui est un défi énorme, et je crois que ça va nous prendre pas mal de temps et d'efforts. Mais c'est vrai qu'en discutant avec toi, on est arrivé à une conclusion qui est plus ou moins la même. C'est finalement, il ne s'agit pas non plus de remplacer l'anthropocentrisme par un biocentrisme ou un zoocentrisme où on place le vivant ou l'animal au centre, parce que ce n'est pas ça le but, mais qu'il s'agissait plutôt de placer donc la relation au centre.
Oui, c'est l'interrelation. Dans la science, c'est plutôt ça. Et après, on a parlé aussi avec lui dans l'architecture que c'est vraiment l'interrelation. Sinon, si on met le biocentrisme, ça veut dire de nouveau retrouver un centre pour quelque chose. Et en fait, le centre est dans la relation qu'on va établir. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai souligné que c'est une relation bidirectionnelle. Parce que chacun, il change, il met quelque chose dans la relation. Et donc...
Et je crois que c'est un des mots qui relie un peu les deux présentations, l'idée de communauté, par exemple. Cette idée de communauté, elle est très présente dans les deux présentations. Et je trouve que c'est quelque chose qui pourrait résumer bien quel est le but, finalement, de cette je ne sais pas si tu veux ajouter des choses, non? Non, ça va. Moi, j'ai plein de questions, mais bon, je ne vais pas monopoliser non plus la parole. Des personnes? Émile? Non? Ça doit te toucher de près ou de loin. Hein. C'est bon? Peut-être que...
Alessandra, maybe you have a question for Francesca or no?
Well, yeah, maybe more a comment. I mean, I couldn't really follow everything because, my French is not that good. But no, it made me think at this essay by Mark Wigley and Lettres Colomina that also talk about human as this kind of mobile ecology or mobile cross-species collaboration, as this kind of human body as the house of microbes, bacteria, and so on, and how we would position that what it means architecture or creating buildings, also considering the human as the house of, or as being this kind of already multi-species collaboration. So maybe it was more like a note than an actual question, but I understood that, there was a connection with this, like in your presentation.
Moi aussi, j'ai trouvé en connexion avec la présentation. En fait, c'est comme si Alessandra a un peu répondu à la question que j'avais posée à la fin. Donc, comment l'architecture elle peut répondre à ces questions de les vivants en nous, de nous. Et en fait, quand je regardais les briques, les matériaux pour oiseaux, ça, je trouve que c'est un peu une réponse. Parce que ça veut dire prévoir qu'il y a la nature aussi, qu'il y a les animaux. Ça, je l'ai trouvé aussi très poétique, mais aussi une réponse pratique à les choses que j'ai posées, à les questions que j'ai posées.
Non, moi, à la limite, j'avais une dernière question. Maybe you understand, mais Alessandra, you use the word hospitality. Et en fait, en français, c'est juste une réflexion comme ça qui me renvoie à un autre texte de Philippe Potier il y a quelques années. I'll get back to you later. Mais le mot hospitalité et le mot hostilité, en fait, c'est la même source latine. Et lui, il avait écrit tout ce texte comme ça, très beau, puisque c'était juste le mur qui faisait la distinction entre ce qui est dehors et ce qui est dedans. Dehors, c'est hostile, dedans, c'est hospitalité. Et voilà, ce mot hospitalité, je trouve qu'il est très juste dans une manière un peu générale de penser l'architecture. Et c'est un terme qui est revenu un tout petit peu ces derniers temps, comme ça, où on peut aussi parler d'architecture en termes d'hospitalité. Je trouve ça, enfin voilà, si quelqu'un veut répondre à ça, enfin, j'ai pas de question, mais c'était juste un truc comme ça.
Bon, le bar est ouvert. Bon, thank you very much. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.